Chapter 20, Dr. Wu. The elevator still smelled like Sasquatch, even though the creature was long gone. Ben tapped his feet nervously as he and Pearl rose to the second floor. "Take a left," Mr. Tabby had told them. Dr. Wu's office is the last room at the very end of the hall. Do not open any doors along the way. This you must promise. "We promise," both Ben and Pearl had vowed. There were no windows in the second floor hallway and no overhead lights. The only light trickled from the end of the hall where a door stood open. "That must be her office," Ben whispered. Pearl led the way, her steps confident and loud, her ponytail swinging. They passed door after door, all closed. Ben wondered if the Sasquatch was behind one, or the dragon hatchling, or another equally amazing creature. But he'd promised not to open any doors, so he kept his hands tucked into his jeans pockets. About halfway down the hall, Pearl's footsteps slowed. Then she stopped walking. "My mom and dad will be wondering where I am," she whispered. "Maybe we should leave." Even in the dim light, Ben could see that Pearl's eyes were as wide as golf balls. "You're the one who wanted to meet her," he said, his voice hushed. "I know, but I'm kind of scared. What if she's mean?" He wasn't going to admit that he also felt a bit scared. He figured that a doctor who worked with dragons had to be fierce, strong, maybe even a bit crazy. "Don't you want to find out about the imaginary world?" Pearl nodded, but she didn't budge. "Come on," Ben said, "we'll walk together." And so, with matching footsteps, they started walking again. A few moments later, they arrived at the open doorway. "Come in," a gentle voice said. Sunlight streamed in through Dr. Wu's windows, which overlooked a small lake. The water sparkled, the factory reflecting on its calm surface. The office itself was a mess, cluttered with baskets, crates, and moving boxes. A huge wooden desk, its legs carved like dragons, sat in the corner of the room. Papers and books covered the desktop. Glass jars filled with cloudy liquids and odd floating things crowded the shelves. A woman stood next to a coat rack, unbuttoning a white laboratory coat. As she hung the coat on a hook, yellow glitter drifted through the air. The woman shook her head and glitter fell from her long black hair. She removed her stethoscope and set it on the desk. Then she folded her hands behind her back and gazed at the kids. "You wanted to see me?" Ben held his breath. Dr. Wu was nothing like he imagined. She wasn't a towering superhero. She stood about his height, which wasn't very tall. Her face was as pale as the moon, her almond-shaped eyes as black as ink. She was beautiful, even with the big scar that ran across one cheek. Another scar ran down her neck. "Hi," Pearl said. Then she nudged Ben. He released his breath. "Hi," he said. "Please sit down." Ben settled on a stack of boxes, as did Pearl. After brushing yellow glitter from her skirt, Dr. Wu sat at her desk and faced the kids. "I've just returned from a house call, so I haven't had time to clean up the fairy dust." "Fairy dust?" Pearl whispered. Dr. Wu tapped her fingers on her desk. Her right index finger was missing. Ben remembered the paper he and Pearl had signed about not blaming Dr. Wu if something crushed, stomped, vaporized, or bit them. Had something bitten off Dr. Wu's finger? Mr. Tabby informed me that you were sent to retrieve the Sasquatch, Dr. Wu said. Clearly, you've been successful. Yes, Ben said. I'm sorry I didn't bolt the door. It was my fault it got out. I also understand that you found our missing wyvern hatchling. Yes, Ben said again. My grandpa's cat heard it. I'm sorry about that too. Did you say fairy dust? Pearl asked. Fairies are real? Dr. Wu didn't answer that question. Instead, she stifled a yawn. Excuse me, I've had a long journey and I need to get some sleep. She leaned back in her chair. What is it you wish to see me about? Pearl looked at Ben. He nodded encouragingly. She scooted to the edge of the box and spat out the following questions at rocket speed. Who are you? And where is the imaginary world? And how do you get to it? And how come no one else knows about it? And if dragons really exist, then how come everyone says they don't? And if there are Sasquatches and dragons, then are fairies real? And what about unicorns? 'Cause I'd really like to meet a unicorn. Can I meet a unicorn? And why do you have yellow glitter in your hair? And she paused for a millisecond. Can we go to the imaginary world with you? She took a long breath, then closed her mouth. Silence filled the room. Ben could hardly keep himself from wiggling as they waited for the doctor's answers. Dr. Wu suddenly sat up very straight. It is always a challenge to keep my hospital a secret, and you two already know more than you should. Her gentle voice turned dark and serious. Something flashed in her eyes. I'm not sure what to do about it. Were they in trouble? Ben shifted nervously. Was Dr. Wu going to tell his parents that he'd caused that big mess in the senior center? And that he'd captured the mulberries with a net? You don't have to do anything, he said. We won't tell anyone about the hospital. That's right, Pearl said, and we won't tell anyone about the Sasquatch. Or the hatchling, Ben said. We promise, Pearl said. Yeah, we promise. Dr. Wu did not appear convinced by these eager promises, for her brow remained furrowed, her lips pursed. She looked from Ben to Pearl and back to Ben. Ben smiled, trying to look like a boy who always told the truth, not like a boy who made up stories. What was the doctor thinking? She looked at Pearl again. Pearl smiled too, the big gap looking like a piece of black licorice stuck between her teeth. Dr. Wu pressed a button on her desk intercom. Mr. Tabby, we have a serious breach in security. Do you have any suggestions? Mr. Tabby's voice drifted from the speaker. We could have the dragon carry them away and leave them somewhere, a mountaintop perhaps, or a deserted island. That is an option, Dr. Wu said. But what if they were rescued? They'd still know our secrets. Very true. Mr. Tabby paused for a moment. Ben was about to assure Dr. Wu once again that he'd tell no one about the hospital when Mr. Tabby said, I have a brilliant idea. We could leave them with the Cyclops. He's always hungry. You've got a Cyclops? Pearl asked. That's so amazing. Ben couldn't believe Pearl was more interested in the fact that Dr. Wu had a Cyclops than the fact that she might feed the kids to the Cyclops. He slid off the boxes, then took a couple of steps backwards. I think we'd better be going. I don't think feeding them to the Cyclops is a good idea, Dr. Wu told Mr. Tabby. Too messy. Too messy? Ben mumbled. How far was that elevator? If he made a run for it, could he get there before Dr. Wu changed her mind? And if the children went missing, we'd have to deal with the local police. There must be a better way to handle this situation, Dr. Wu said. Hey, Pearl said, as she also slid off the boxes. What are you talking about? You don't need to do anything. Ben and I promised. We promised. Once again, Dr. Wu's gaze traveled from Ben to Pearl and back to Ben. I wonder... She leaned her elbows on the table. I wonder... She tapped her fingers again. I've only done this one other time, but I wonder if... Ben took a few more steps backward. He was in the doorway now, his legs poised and ready to bolt if the dreaded words, feed them to the, came out of Dr. Wu's mouth. Mr. Tabby? Dr. Wu said. Yes. I think I have the solution. Dr. Wu's face relaxed. They seemed like nice kids, and it takes skill and cunning to catch a Sasquatch. Since they already know too much, and since we could use some extra hands around here, she smiled. I will make them my apprentices.